In this session, we'll be talking about Neo Evangelicalism, or as it's sometimes known, just evangelicalism. Neo Evangelicalism, as we'll note, is a term that gets used in the 1940s, 1950s, but is gradually dropped from the group. Now, to really think about some of the things related to Neo Evangelicalism, we have to kind of pick up the narrative where we left off with fundamentalism. So if you remember from when we were talking about fundamentalism, the early part of the 20th century looked rather positive for fundamentalists in that they had made a variety of strides, even though there were some conflicts that were taking place between fundamentalists and modernists over denominations, seminaries, a variety of other institutions. Fundamentalists were making some pretty good strides. The Scopes trial, however, overturns a lot of that effort. That even though John Scopes was found guilty of teaching evolution and breaking the Butler Act, in a large way, fundamentalists lost because of how they were presented in the aftermath of that trial. Another area where they had lost was the repeal of prohibition. As we mentioned, of course, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution had prohibited the manufacture and sale of alcohol in the United States. But because of a variety of political pressure as well as the increase in crime that developed because of prohibition, that was eventually repealed in the 21st Amendment to the Constitution. A lot of that it was reflected in the antagonism that developed in popular culture. We talked about the media and its kind of caricature of fundamentalists as being backwards, as being corrupt or hucksters, all sorts of negative depictions in popular culture, whether it's novels, the news media, even eventually in film. But fundamentalists themselves also participated in this in sometimes some very extreme positions, very antagonistic positions to American culture, all of this participating in a kind of retreat of conservative evangelicals, particularly fundamentalists, from being a part of American culture. And in the wake of this decline, there were a couple of things that fundamentalists attempted to do to replace the American culture with their own kind of alternative culture. So as they gradually lost control of seminaries, they started new institutions, started Bible institutes, Bible colleges. There would be efforts by conservative evangelicals and fundamentalists to start their own seminaries eventually, but a lot of the educational institutions that were started were predominantly Bible institutes and colleges that would have been kind of like what we think of undergraduate, predominantly focused on ministerial training, but also opportunities for other people to come and study the Bible if they wanted to be missionaries, etc. Summer camps and conferences were created as a replacement for or an alternative to a variety of secular options that existed at the time. Development of their own media, newspapers, books, written, and then radio, written and produced by fundamentalists. The key thing here was that they were looking to create alternatives. These are alternatives to what exists in the culture already. We also talked about that in many respects there was a rise of some very militant fundamentalists during this time, that they were very antagonistic to aspects of American culture particularly those that were secular, but also against any of those that weren't fundamentalists. So liberal Protestantism, Catholicism were certainly targets as well as just regular American culture as well. Several of these individuals created their own media, newspapers. Bob Jones Sr., for example, also creates a Bible Institute, Bible College. There is the American Council of Christian Churches that is created as a fundamentalist alternative to the federal, later National Council of Churches, which was an organization that attempted to bring together a variety of denominations to work together for common cause. Fundamentalists believed, because of the institutions that were represented in the Federal Council of Churches, that it was, it wasn't that it was a false group of heretical Christianity, and so the American Council of Christian Churches was created as an alternative to that for fundamentalist churches and denominations to associate together. So that kind of sets the stage a little bit for where we're talking about with Neo Evangelicalism, right? There's this kind of pulling back. There is this creation of these alternatives. There is this militancy that tends to kind of create a distinct culture, a subculture, in comparison to American culture. But in many respects, fundamentalism, conservative evangelicalism, it's not like it's disappearing. And there's great transformations that take place both in fundamentalism and in American culture through the 1930s and 40s that are important to note to set the stage for some developments. And one of those has to do with migration. Now, we tend to think of course, the Bible Belt as being the South. We did note how, as fundamentalism started, it was largely a urban northern phenomenon, but in the 1920s it becomes much more of a southern phenomenon, and especially, in reality, yes, but also in the minds of people that it becomes very southern. But it wasn't entirely southern. In fact, in the 1930s and 40s, there is this shift that takes place as a variety of Southerners are uprooted and moved to, and they left the South and moved to California. A lot of this has to do with the Dust Bowl phenomenons that take place, various droughts, reflected in something like the Grapes of Wrath. Of course, the Great Depression is taking place during this time as well. And as these people migrated to California, they brought with them kind of a very plain folk evangelicalism, fundamentalism that was a part of their identity. Between the 1930s and the 1960s, over 6 million Southerners relocated to urban industrial centers. Even up north like Detroit, upper Midwest, and Los Angeles as well. And by 1970, 11 million Southerners lived outside their home states. And really, even a place like California in 1969 claimed more Southern residents than even a state like Arkansas, which, is kind of South, kind of Midwest. Now, with that, in California, there is a large growth that takes place in these evangelical fundamentalist groups. Now, certainly we don't tend to think of fundamentalism and evangelicalism as being a California phenomenon, but it really is to some extent, right? There's a California type of idea. And, with that, they also brought kind of their own version of evangelicalism that some scholars have referred to as a Texas theology. Now, this Texas theology, largely, of course, coming from Texas, but from other places in the South, and it's represented by an unwillingness to compromise doctrine. Right? That there is this notion of the certainty of being right, and so since you're certain of being right, then why would you compromise on what is true, what is right? And so this Texas theology becomes a very important marker of fundamentalism and conservative evangelicalism, of, again, kind of another layer of separatism. Right? There's a sociological separatism that we'll reference here again in a minute, but there's also kind of a doctrinal separation as well. Another aspect of these groups tended to be congregational autonomy. They tended to be people that weren't as interested in denominational structures or having denominational hierarchy kind of telling them what they needed to do, but instead each church was kind of ideally separate. But these individuals were also very active in evangelism. And so evangelicalism grows substantially in California compared to what it had been before. And so we have here kind of the beginnings of what will eventually become a conservative resurgence that we'll talk about here in a little bit. And this is one component of where the Christian or religious right comes from, is this kind of shift that takes place as Southerners migrate to places like California and then become active in their communities there. And they're leaving for a variety of reasons, right? That's where industry is. Of course, we're getting close to World War II, and so there's a variety of efforts there, there's a lot of opportunities for people to have jobs, and so those kind of things are a part of this transformation of evangelicalism that is a very important part of this, what will eventually be a transformation of fundamentalism to Neo Evangelicalism. Another important component to this time period is the social vision that fundamentalists are holding on to. Now, one of the things to remember is that there is a switch that happens in the late 19th century where what had been a pretty pan-evangelical concern for social change largely becomes associated with the social gospel in liberal Protestantism. And so there is that great reversal that takes place in fundamentalism. And that's reflected in their social vision for society. A lot of the focus was on individual salvation. As we've mentioned before, the idea was that fundamentalists believed that if individuals were saved, that would lead to, as a consequence, changes in society. So the focus became much more active on evangelism than any sort of efforts to try and transform society through massive political means. It doesn't mean that fundamentalists were completely separated from politics, although a lot of them had negative views toward being involved in politics. But it did mean that there weren't these massive efforts to create widespread social change among fundamentalists like there had been among a wide group of evangelicals in the 19th century. One area, though, that was particularly concerning was communism. And so fundamentalists were very, very concerned about the spread of communism, certainly abroad, right? This is the time period of the Soviet Union. So they're concerned about that. They're concerned about the Soviet Union and communism spreading in other countries. but they're also concerned about the spread of communism in the United States, and so they become very active in support of a variety of anti-communist figures, like Senator Joseph McCarthy, who does a variety of congressional investigations about communism, so they're very kind of supportive of that. They're very supportive of other movements that are anti-communist. But largely, while there is some political activism that fundamentalists engage in, largely it is not a great effort. That most of the activism that is undertaken by fundamentalists is on a local scale, not on a national scale like it had been before. Right? So there is some activism. They've not completely separated themselves, but a large part of it is anti-communism and local efforts. Because a large part of fundamentalism's social vision was shaped by that dispensational premillennialist outlook. The assumption that Jesus is soon to return, so the focus needs to be on winning souls, not transforming society, because the only way society is going to be completely transformed is through the second coming of Jesus. Right? It's going to be wholly supernatural. There's not going to be any human effort involved in it. It is totally a development that is going to take place at the end of time. And so that kind of bleeds into an idea of why try to make great changes, because A, you're not going to be able to, and B, only Jesus can when he returns. And so fundamentalists have this great shift in what they think about being involved as well. But not everybody fell into that. Not everybody continues to uphold that separatism. We noticed that as we finished up talking about fundamentalism. Right? You have that one group that is absolutely militant about its separatism. And I don't want to downplay the militancy. In fact, one of the difficulties sometimes is describing who an evangelical is and who a fundamentalist is, and some scholars have tongue-in-cheek said a fundamentalist is an evangelical who's angry about something, right? There is such a militancy in fundamentalism at this time period we're talking about, 1930s, 1940s. And it's not just directed towards those outside the fundamentalist camp, right? The Catholics, liberal Protestants, communists. It's also directed towards anyone that would identify as a fundamentalist who would associate or work with or cooperate with non-fundamentalist groups. Right? So if you would engage in any sort of activity with a liberal Protestant or with a Catholic, right, there's going to be a lot of blowback from other fundamentalists on that. So you have this one side that wants to hold on to that militancy, that separatism, that come out ideology. But the other side wants to be more involved in culture, right? They don't want the separatism. They still have the same kind of theology, right? They are still fundamentalists theologically, but they have a different view about the boundaries. Right? Should we have hard boundaries? Should we have porous boundaries? Do these boundaries kind of keep us from associating with, working with other groups that may not be fundamentalist? And so Neo Evangelicals are more open to that. And so this split that begins to take place in fundamentalism between fundamentalists and Neo Evangelicals is predominantly about sociology, not theology, because they very much have similar types of theology. What also helps Neo-Evangelicalism is a general post-war revival, post-World War II. In the aftermath of World War II, there is an increase in church attendance. Now, in many respects, this is true across religious groups. It happens for evangelicals, certainly, but it also happens with Catholics, liberal Protestants, Jews. A lot of these groups in the United States are seeing greater attendance at their religious services. I guess we should say, greater synagogue attendance for Jews, but greater church attendance as well for Christian groups. New buildings are being built, so greater, larger buildings. Many starting to incorporate other things like gymnasiums, other types of centers, different things within these buildings. But in many respects, we have this increase in the number of buildings, increase in the size of buildings. Bible study becomes very common. More and more people involved in Bible study, and predominantly Bible study in homes. And it's also a time of a variety of public intellectuals that they are featured on news programs. They're featured in Time magazine. They show up in a variety of other types of public venues, and people are interested in hearing what these ministers, these theologians, have to say about religion. And as I mentioned, this is across religions. This isn't just something that is prevalent in certain groups, but is a part of across the board religious groups. And so these kind of factors help the rise and the success of evangelicalism. As these Neo Evangelicals move towards being a part again of the American culture. And so there were a couple of steps that individuals took to bring about a greater involvement in society. One was the creation of the National Association of Evangelicals. A man named Harold Ockenga, who graduated from Westminster Theological Seminary, which had been started as an evangelical institution. He's a fundamentalist. He's a preacher in Boston. In 1942, he kind of wants to have an organization of more progressive, culturally engaged evangelicals. And so he begins to gather some individuals together to help create this organization, the National Association of Evangelicals. But one of the things that gets him some condemnation from fundamentalists is that he's allowing Pentecostals to be a part of this, and we'll talk about Pentecostals in another session. Other non-fundamentalists, and so the fundamentalists absolutely hate the National Association of Evangelicals, or the come-outer fundamentalists. Seem to be the ones that are the most opposed to this. So you have the creation of the National Association of Evangelicals as one step towards this. Another effort that is kind of bringing back evangelicals into society is the creation of Fuller Seminary. Fuller Seminary was started by a man named Charles Fuller, who was at the time a radio evangelist, had a very popular program called the Old Fashioned Revival Hour. And it's supported by listener contributions. It's not from a church per se, like some other groups we've looked at. He will start Fuller Theological Seminary. He names it after his father, but largely as a response to these mainline seminaries, these modernist seminaries, as well as the fundamentalist seminaries. So this is meant to be kind of a evangelical, actively engaged seminary, trying to bring back what he thinks is some intellectual respectability back to evangelicalism. And so, there's an effort to kind of give evangelicals some respectability. Westminster Theological, somewhat similar. It had broken off of Princeton Theological because of, the kind of the mainline direction that Princeton was going, and so it had largely at the time been predominantly fundamentalist. One of the big individuals that really helps these neo-evangelicals back into greater involvement with society, though, is a man named Billy Graham. Graham was born in 1918 near Charlotte, North Carolina. He would graduate eventually from Wheaton College and later joined the staff of a group called Youth for Christ, which was focused on evangelizing teens, young adults, and so a lot of the focus is on younger people, hence the name Youth for Christ. Well, eventually Graham, as he's getting older, wants to kind of move from just focusing on youth and wants to, kind of engage a larger group. And so he goes around doing some revivals, doing some crusades. In his later life, Graham will draw hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people to some of these crusades. And his audience will be in the millions because it'll be televised and some other things. But as he starts off, he's not spectacularly successful, and he, doesn't have anywhere near the success that he will later have. He does have. He goes to Great Britain, does have some success there, comes back, and starts a crusade in Los Angeles in 1949. And this is really the kind of moment that Billy Graham starts coming into his own. And largely it has to do with not only he's preaching a Christian message, but he's preaching a very anti-communist message. Now, communism at the time is largely represented by the Soviet Union. There are a few other communist countries. By this point, 1949, China has become communist. So some pretty sizable groups of people that are communist. The concern that Graham and a lot of others had was, yes, the communism, but the atheism that was attendant with it, and the expansion that was taking place of communist countries. Right? Soviet Union gradually extending its influence into Eastern Europe. A variety of countries become communistic through the 40s and 50s. China extending down into Vietnam, Korea. Right, so it's not just that there are communist countries; it's spreading, and they are atheistic, and so there's a great concern for it's godliness versus atheism. Now that godliness was often connected with America, right? The America needs to remain godly to stand against this atheistic communism. Well, once word starts to get around about Graham having this very anti-communist message, a newspaper owner named William Randolph Hearst, who had a pretty good-sized newspaper empire, decides he wants to support Graham. And so he utters two words, supposedly, right? This is the tradition, that some scholars have said the two most famous words in American religious history. Puff, or maybe not famous, but important, two of the most important words in American religious history. Puff, Graham. Right? So basically Hearst saying to his newspapers, you need to produce these puff pieces, or you need to positively promote Billy Graham. And it's not because Hearst was, a great religious person, but more he was very anti-communist. And so here you have Billy Graham, very well spoken, younger man, attractive man, very well dressed, promoting this anti-communist message. So the media backing he gets is very important, and so the crusade in Los Angeles explodes in attendance. There are also several famous celebrities that come that claim conversion, and so that gets even more publicizing. And so Graham, here's where the shift takes place from these moderately successful revival groups to these huge crusades that he starts engaging in throughout the United States, but eventually throughout the world. And his prominence does eventually, begin to get him some greater attention, and it does lead to some political involvement, and he ends up gaining access to a variety of political figures, including many presidents, from Dwight Eisenhower in the 50s through President George W. Bush in the first part of this new millennium. Graham has met frequently with presidents. He even met some, though not as extensively, with President Obama as well. So, there's a lot of access that Graham gets. He was much more active in some ways in politics in the early part of his career. For example, in 1960, he meets with other evangelicals to try and stop the candidacy of to stop the success of Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy because of his Catholicism. Right, so he's very anti-Catholic here. It's really kind of his association with Richard Nixon that leads him to change some minds. Right, he's predominantly fairly good associates, maybe even friends with Richard Nixon, both as he's vice president and then later as he's president. And so Graham becomes very supportive of Nixon in a variety of places, only to find out later, Nixon, he isn't, obviously he was, an immoral person and corrupt in a variety of ways. He is vulgar in private, right? Uses a lot of language that's inappropriate. So Graham once he really finds out who Nixon is, kind of says, maybe I've gotten in too deep. Graham just passed away a few years ago, but was very successful even later in life in drawing these large audiences. And so, as he was getting close to retirement and death, as he's getting up in his late 80s, 90s, a lot of religious figures were starting to be compared to Graham. Is this person the next Billy Graham? And I don't think there really has been anybody since Graham that has had the same. I mean, there's a lot of popular preachers out there that have very wide breadth of influence, but I don't think anybody nearly like Billy Graham was at the height of his career. Evangelicalism wasn't just present in kind of the churches like we think of it, something like a Billy Graham, a minister, expressions like that. Evangelicalism also kind of made its way into some other types of formats and features that were unique for the 60s, particularly something like the Jesus People. So in the later part of the 60s, and really even before that, a large number of young adults became disaffected with mainstream American society. They just weren't very, not so much weren't patriotic, but they weren't just as committed to America as their parents' generation has. Lies over Vietnam, the conservative style of their parents, the connections that American Christianity had, especially in kind of what appeared to be a more imperialistic type of view. A lot of those young people really created their own kind of counterculture, and that had an impact as well. So you have these group of people known as hippies who rejected the customs of society. Some started communes for kind of communal living, but also kind of adopted additional alternative lifestyles, use of drugs for altering consciousness, etc. Well, there were a lot of young people within Christian communities that did that as well, and kind of rejected the more formal approaches to Christianity. And so you have these young people who don't want to completely abandon them, right? They don't want to completely abandon Christianity, but they want to take some of the elements of these countercultural lifestyle, right? The communal living, the rejection of the formalism of church life and worship, strip down Christianity, get rid of the theological language, put ideas and concepts in kind of vernacular, and really kind of take Christianity and make it more along the lines of the counterculture that they're seeing at the time. And so the Jesus people arise out of this movement, kind of taking some elements of Christianity, taking some elements of the countercultural approach that they're seeing among the hippies. And a lot of this really gets started in 1967 in what's known as the Summer of Love, right? In Haight-Ashbury Park in San Francisco, there was a lot of free love, rise of hippie lifestyle, counterculture, all this going on. And in the midst of this, there are efforts by Christians to minister to these hippies. So a man named Chuck Smith founds Calvary Chapel, and to minister to some of these young people in this counterculture. And in 6 months, the church goes from about 200 people to 2,000 people. Hundreds of teens are being baptized in the ocean. These beach baptisms are happening, once a month. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of people being baptized. These are people that are, they're burned out on drugs, right? They kind of got so much into the drug lifestyle, and they're just, they realize, that there's no meaning in that drug lifestyle. So they're wanting to find something else. They are people that have run away from home, and they're trying to find identity. They are, pregnant teens. They're teens that are, they tended to be rule-following teens, but they're looking for something different, right? So they're coming for all sorts of reasons. They're often referred to as street Christians because they are very evangelistic. They're hippie evangelists, right? They are evangelizing on the streets, beaches. They're out in public. Some of them are creating newspapers that they would hand out. Some of them are just going up to people, start talking to them about Jesus. There's all sorts of ways that these individuals are evangelizing. Now, I'm talking here about people of that young age. Right? There's ministers like Chuck Smith, who is kind of older people, but these are people that are actually hippies. Now, there were a couple of different types of street Christians. there were those that were referred to as the Jesus freaks. These were the ones that adopted the most of the hippie lifestyle. They have the long hair, walk around in bare feet. They adopted these kind of blissful smiles. They're smiling all the time. But these are the people that tended towards the communal type of living. Eventually, a lot of the ex-hippies dropped the look, but it's still that's one group of this. Another group are kids that have been a part of groups like Campus Crusade for Christ, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, Young Life, Youth for Christ. These are people that are active. Right? They're interested in Christianity, but they don't like being a part of denominations. Right? So you have the Jesus freaks, you have these youth that have come, to associate their religious ideology with some of these, parachurch organizations. And then you have some that are more just kind of charismatics. A lot of the people tend to be middle-class youth from some of these traditional groups, and they're just looking for something different. And so they're really wanting to make a transition. This Jesus people craze starts in California, but will gradually spread throughout the country. Bringing in all sorts of people. Eventually, a couple different groups arise. So you have one group called the Jesus People Army, another called Jesus People USA, and then there's the Children of God. The Children of God was more a... People get concerned about the Children of God because it becomes much more cult-like. It was started by a guy named David Berg, who kind of taps into some ministry his mother was doing, kind of preaching, handing out peanut butter sandwiches. He's so kind of trying to minister to people that way. He was very apocalyptic, focused on the last days, was really preaching a lot of the idea of total commitment, right? That people had to be totally committed to the movement. He eventually claims he was God's end-time prophet, starts calling himself Moses. The group was first called Teens for Christ, and then eventually changed Children of God. They create these communes. He wrote a lot to his followers. They call them Mo letters, coming from Moses, these Mo letters. But eventually there are charges of him kidnapping people, claims that it's a cult. There were all sorts of accusations about sex and universal love. Berg dies in 92. There's still kind of a group that's still part of that, but it's a smaller group today. But you have these different groups. It even leads to some celebrity conversions. People like Bob Dylan, Johnny Cash, some others that are kind of converted to this message. There were a couple of different places that this began to develop. One is the efforts of Ted and Elizabeth Wise. They become Christians in 1967, started witnessing, particularly to their friends, become very successful in converting their friends, start a communal living situation, eventually opened a storefront coffee house that they called the Living Room. They did have some support from local ministers, offered soup to people, coffee, a place to, kind of congregate, and ministered to tens of thousands of people, including Charles Manson, the serial killer, and kind of cult-like leader, had come through there as well. they eventually moved to a farmhouse with a group of friends, so this communal living. They still spend some time in San Francisco, but they are probably the two that are the most important, really starting a lot of this effort. A man named Arthur Blessitt was another street preacher, Southern Baptist, opens a mission and coffee house on the Sunset Strip called His Place. And so he is another one of these important figures. Chuck Smith, we've already kind of mentioned. He's older than some of these other individuals. Starts Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa, California. Very kind of small, conservative church. But he meets a man named Lonnie Frisbee, who had been converted by Ted and Elizabeth Wise. He had been a drug addict, came from a broken home, and took LSD, and he would read the Bible. And, he would preach to his friends while he's tripping on acid. And so Frisbee and Smith eventually meet. Frisbee was very charismatic as a leader, but then he was also a Pentecostal, believed in healing, prophecy, speaking in tongues, something like we'll talk about when we talk about Pentecostalism. He paints Jesus on this deer skin and wears it like a cape. So really kind of adopting a strange type of lifestyle, but the movement begins to grow. And so Frisbee at one point says, God is blowing everybody's minds because he's saving the hippies. Right? So he's becomes one of the most successful. And Smith and Frisbee really kind of believe, and working together, really expand this. One of the things they think would be important is to develop new music. Right? So they start a variety of groups at Calvary Chapel. They kind of start there, create a new record label. One of the groups that starts at Calvary that becomes pretty popular is called Love Song. It was actually a group that was a nightclub act and had been involved with drugs, tried a variety of religion, but Smith converted them, and it does pretty well. They record an album. It becomes #1 in the Philippines at one point. Other bands start at Calvary. They start their own record label called Maranatha Music. They would often have these free concerts at Calvary Chapel. Another figure that becomes well known through this Jesus rock is a man named Larry Norman. Growing up, Norman was a Baptist, but he hated hymns. So he got involved in playing in rock and roll bands. He was actually offered a contract with Capitol Records at the age of 18 and toured as an opening act for the Grateful Dead, Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, as a part of a group called People, and it was People with an exclamation point after it. When People breaks up, he starts preaching on the street, performing as a solo act, and he really kind of has this idea of why should the devil have all the good music, right? So, a lot of people at the time connected rock and roll with the devil, and it was devil music. And so Norman is like, well, let's take over this music, right? And one of the expressions of this, there's these groups starting, festivals start, and there's this huge gathering in 1972 called Explo 72. It's also referred to as Godstock, play on Woodstock in the 1960s. In June of 1972, they gathered in Texas, in Dallas, Texas. 200,000 people. They had this enormous stage, and musicians from all over. It wasn't just Jesus rock. There was folk rock people there. Chris Christopherson was there. Johnny Cash was there. Billy Graham was a featured speaker. A lot of the focus, of course, was on high school and college students. It wasn't just music. It was held in the Cotton Bowl, and there were other conferences that came up that were done. So for 5 days, there's these conferences, people coming from over 100 countries for these seminars during the day and these rallies and concerts at night. Now, there's not a lot of hippies, right? Most of them are just these kind of middle-class high school and college students. Billy Graham was a featured speaker, as I mentioned, and really he tries to co-opt some aspects of the youth culture, really likes the idea of this embrace of evangelical religion in these kind of youth formats. Remember, he had started out, Youth for Christ. At this point, Graham is in his late 50s. So he's certainly beyond that point. He's certainly successful as a traveling revivalist and with his crusades. But so he's trying to incorporate some elements of that. But his popularity is a feature of this as well. And this Jesus rock does have an impact on evangelicalism as well, in that you have these kind of new worship styles that come out of this that become pretty mainstream. Things like praise choruses, worship music, very, very common, in a lot of worship today. Even among the most traditional and conservative evangelicals, you still have, these worship songs, contemporary, and a lot of the praise choruses, they tend to be, kind of simplified lyrics, repeated over and over, a lot of focus on emotional conceptions of God, relational imagery, that kind of thing. And so you have that influence, but then you also have the mainstreaming of Jesus rock into contemporary Christian music, right? And so as pop culture music has developed and modified, so has contemporary Christian. And so a lot of the styles that you see in contemporary Christian reflect styles you see in secular music because of that notion of alternatives, right? Providing these alternatives to secular culture. Services become much more informal, sermons becoming more informal as well. Again, not across the board, but you do see some of that coming out of the Jesus movement. You also see these megachurches. Now, megachurch refers to a church of 2,000 or more people. These huge churches, these thousands, sometimes tens of thousands and so you, instead of these local smaller congregations, you have these mega churches, and a lot of that carries out of the Jesus people. And the celebrity ministers is also a facet that comes out of this. In fact, one type of aspect of these celebrity ministers is reflected in something that became very popular in the 80s, and that was televangelism. Now, televangelism was around before the 80s, but it really comes to popular attention in the 80s, and we'll talk about why here in a minute. We talked about Oral Roberts, or we will talk about Oral Roberts in Pentecostalism, and Roberts, is back on television in the 50s, right? So, as soon as television was around, there were preachers on television, and so ministers and churches, continued to find these new ways to use technology. With the creation of televisions, many preachers tried to get on it to provide religious broadcasting, and there were a couple of different facets of this. Some were groups that, or it would be just a basic broadcast of a service, right? And so it's just a church service that's being broadcast. Others might just have it's just a preacher delivering a lesson, but he's just doing it to the camera, right? So there's varieties that are of ways that this is done. And at some point, somebody coins the term televangelist to talk about these people, these celebrity preachers, who are on television. Now, often the term was very pejorative. It wasn't a positive term because a lot of these people were looked upon as, they're just in it for the money, because they often made individual appeals for financial contributions from their audiences. So, there was a very negative approach. A lot of the most successful ones tended to be more on the Pentecostal charismatic line. Again, we'll talk more about Pentecostalism in another session. A couple of the ones that were the most famous in the 70s through the 80s would have been people like Jimmy Swaggart. Swaggart was born in the 1930s, Pentecostal. Eventually, he kind of backs away from Pentecostalism. He gets involved with the prosperity gospel, and he gradually backs away from that. Starts a television ministry that becomes pretty popular. And he's also a musician. He's actually the cousin of a rock and roll musician known as Jerry Lee Lewis. Another prominent televangelist during this time, the 60s, 70s, 80s, is a man named Jerry Falwell, Baptist, preached in Lynchburg, Virginia, would start a radio ministry, later start a television ministry, would also go on to start a college, which is now today known as Liberty University, supposedly the largest religious university in the world. Falwell was very much a separatist fundamentalist. He backed off some of that eventually, but he was also segregationist early in his career, 1950s and 60s. But he remained largely apolitical to the 1970s, and actually preached a sermon called "Of Ministers and Marches" that said ministers should not be out politically demonstrating, that they should be in the pulpit preaching, very much attacking Martin Luther King. He eventually would help start the Moral Majority, so we'll talk about that in a little bit. Another popular televangelist was a man named Pat Robertson, educated at Yale Law School, but he decides to enter the ministry. He had grown up Baptist, but became a charismatic in the 1950s. Purchased a TV station in 1960 and started what became known as the Christian Broadcasting Network. The key program of CBN was the 700 Club. He started out looking for 700 members to donate $10 a month. He gradually expanded the television ministry, would start a university known as Regent University there in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Eventually, he renamed his channel the Family Channel. He kind of starts bringing in a variety of programming. The 700 Club was still very important, but it would also have family movies programming as well. Eventually, it gets so successful that the ministry is in danger of it being nonprofit because of the success of the Family Channel, and so he sells it off. He actually sells it off to Rupert Murdoch, who's behind like Fox News, a couple other Fox, Fox, the television station. He sells it for $200 million. And the requirement is that the 700 Club still has to be broadcast twice a day. Eventually, the Family Channel, which became known as Fox Family Channel, was sold to Disney. Then the requirement was still there about the 700 Club being one, and eventually Disney rebranded it to ABC Family, and most recently it's branded as Freeform, I believe. I don't believe it's changed since then. But the 700 Club was still on there. And usually it got to the point, and this is several years ago, where there would be a title card before the 700 Club started, basically a disclaimer of, the views expressed in this program do not reflect the views of ABC Family or Freeform or whatever, because there's such a different mindset that was being presented in this fundamentalist evangelical televangelist program. One of the things that really impacted the negative view of televangelists was a variety of scandals that took place in the 1980s. Some of those had to do with financial misdealings, like the case of Jim Bakker, who ends up going to prison over some financial issues, some financial dealings. Some of it involved sexual indiscretion, like Jimmy Swaggart there in the upper right-hand corner was caught photographed with a prostitute a couple of times. Bakker as well was also involved in some sexual indiscretion. So there's money issues, tax evasion, financial misdealings. Swaggart actually, and he's the one in the upper right-hand corner, had set up a situation to trap another minister in sexual infidelity, and then ended up getting kind of caught himself, right? So you have these televangelists trying to frame each other to bring each other's ministries down. So there's affairs, prostitutes, both heterosexual and homosexual indiscretions. So there's all sorts of things scandal-wise that adds to the negative view of televangelism and, to some extent, evangelicalism as well. All of this is reflective, again, of this greater connection that is taking place in Neo Evangelicalism related to its connection to a larger American culture. And a large part of that is the ways in which evangelicals, or another aspect of this is the way in which Neo Evangelicals are becoming more involved in politics and culture. Now, despite a lot of the things that we've talked about up until this point, a lot of individuals, fundamentalists, had largely been kind of against political involvement. But a couple of things happened in the 1960s and 70s that led to evangelicals being more open and active in this. A lot of people will point to Roe v. Wade and the decision about abortion as being the moment that sparked the evangelical resurgence in politics, but that's not really the case. While Roe had a success, Roe was part of the success of conservative evangelicalism. Well, not success, but Roe was part of a larger scale involvement. But there wasn't too much of an outcry when Roe v. Wade was first decided. It wasn't until the 1980s. Instead, it was the efforts of the IRS to revoke the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University, which was in South Carolina. Bob Jones was very racially discriminatory in its admissions policies, right? And attempted to prohibit African Americans from enrolling. And so the IRS says, okay, this is after desegregation, a lot of, integration, a lot of things. And so how can you be a charitable institution if you're discriminating against people? And so they moved to revoke Bob Jones's tax-exempt status. Well, that was going to have a broader effect because, a lot of the Christian schools that had started in the 1960s and 70s were segregation academies. They were created to discriminate, and so a lot of people felt that Christian schools were being targeted, and to some extent they were. And so there was a lot of attention given to Bob Jones and the Bob Jones case, which led to more people being involved politically. Another part of the increase of evangelicals in politics was the work of a man named Francis Schaeffer. Schaeffer was a minister, was fundamentalist early on, became more evangelical, had been a Presbyterian, moved to Switzerland at one point, and he too, like some others, was concerned about kind of the intellectual dearth in evangelicalism. That there just wasn't a good intellectual engagement with the world around them, and feeling that as well that culture itself had lost an idea of absolute truth, and that this had had a profound impact on Western culture. So he starts a youth-oriented study center in Switzerland known as L'Abri, and draws large numbers of people to that. People traveling through Europe, other people are drawn there to engage Schaeffer, and so he begins to be very concerned about intellectual trends, starts making lectures, comes back to the U.S., makes several lectures in the U.S., writes a book called How Should We Then Live?, kind of related to the decline of Western civilization and what that all means. And then wrote another book called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, which eventually is turned into a film series. And it's largely because of his son's efforts to get him involved in efforts to stop abortion, right? So Whatever Happened to the Human Race is a discussion of the impact of abortion along with some other factors. And so this, it's Schaeffer's concern of abortion that leads him, and he's concerned about Roe v. Wade, that leads him to become more active in anti-abortion efforts, and then draw other evangelicals as well. And so Francis Schaeffer kind of leads people to be more concerned about the decline of Western civilization, the rise of abortion, some other moral issues going on, and that is all connected with Jerry Falwell and the rise of the moral majority. All right, so you have these concerns about laws, abortion, the need to be politically involved, and out of this comes this moral majority. So the moral majority, of course, is a big switch for Jerry Falwell, because Falwell had been very outspoken against Martin Luther King and others for being politically active, and yet here he is, just a little less than 2 decades later, starting this political movement. Now, a lot of this is the working through of evangelicals trying to be more politically active. And they have some hope in 1976 when Jimmy Carter, the governor of Georgia, Southern Baptist, even as governor, still active in teaching Sunday school class. In fact, he still teaches Sunday school class. With all the pandemic and everything, before he and his wife had been fully vaccinated, he kind of backed off, but has returned at least to worship. I don't know if he's back to teaching his Bible class, but people flock to hear him give this Bible class in Georgia. So, here's this evangelical who's talking about this born again experience, and so Newsweek magazine, other magazines refer to 1976 as the year of the evangelical, right? And so they're trying, who are these evangelicals? Because they've largely gone unnoticed by popular culture. And so, here's Carter out there talking about this born again experience, talking about being evangelical. A lot of evangelicals very interested in supporting Carter, right? Having one of their own. But after Carter's elected, their evangelicals, fundamentalists, become very dissatisfied with some of Carter's policies, his appointment of a variety of non-evangelicals to positions in his administration, and so evangelicals don't have a very prime role in the Carter administration. And so the moral majority takes this dissatisfaction and turns it towards support of Carter's opponent in 1980, a man named Ronald Reagan. And so Reagan very successfully garnered the evangelical vote and the presidency. Now, eventually, there's some people that are dissatisfied with Reagan. He doesn't fulfill all the things that they think he should have fulfilled. His vice president, the first George Bush, he's not overly evangelical. I mean, he's religious, but he's not evangelical. He's more mainline. So Pat Robertson, the televangelist, decides to run for presidency in 1988 against Bush. After Reagan had finished, he does have some early successes, but eventually Bush's popularity kind of wins out, and so Robertson leaves. And Robertson believes he still has enough support, and he kind of moves his supporters into the formation of a movement known as the Christian Coalition. Now, the moral majority disbands in 1989. It's only around for about 10 years or so. The Christian Coalition kind of rises to take its place, but the Christian Coalition is more focused on grassroots initiatives, right? Moral majority was very much national elections. Christian Coalition isn't against, working on national elections, but they're also concerned about the school board, right? They're concerned about the county commissioners. And so the belief is that, if you make these impacts on the local level, these lower levels of government, eventually impact is going to be felt at the top as well. And so these movements of evangelicals, conservative evangelicals, is sometimes referred to as the Christian right or the religious right, and has been at various times very successful in shaping local as well as national politics. Evangelicals were very instrumental in the election of George W. Bush in 2000, 2004. Seemed to be somewhat of a split in 2008 with a sizable group of younger evangelicals supporting Barack Obama and not very many supporting John McCain. Something similar in 2012. Less evangelical support for Barack Obama then, not enough support for Mitt Romney, Mormon, in 2012, but a huge support for Donald Trump in both 2016 and 2020. But opposition to President Trump was significant enough to kind of overlook or overturn some of that evangelical support, but large numbers of evangelicals supported President Trump. But that's not to say that the only way that evangelicals have been involved in politics is from the conservative side. And so there have been a sizable minority, yes, it's a minority, of evangelicals who have been against this kind of marriage of evangelicalism and the Republican Party. And so fundamentalism, it had been something that people were concerned about. And while you had this trajectory that leads to conservative politics that we've been looking at, there are some other things that have led to more of a liberal or progressive politics. Now, conservatives and progressives in evangelicalism often held the same theological views, same things about church and worship and things like that in the Bible, but often had different political views. One of the key figures in the rise of a progressive evangelicalism was a man named Carl Henry. He was born in 1913 on Long Island. Largely, his parents were irreligious, so he didn't really grow up religious. At the age of 19, he becomes a reporter and editor for a local newspaper. He converts in 1933 and decides to further his education. So he goes to Wheaton College in Illinois. And there, professors encouraged him to see the Christian mission being about cultural transformation and not just individual salvation. So he goes on, gets a PhD from Boston, will eventually teach at Fuller Theological Seminary, and in 1947 released the book The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism, arguing that fundamentalism had largely been not humanitarian, and had kind of turned away from humanitarian outgrowth, and that largely fundamentalism did not address modern evils. It did not have a word to say about aggressive warfare, racial hatred, the exploitation of labor. There was no social passion in fundamentalists. Instead, fundamentalists focused on alcohol, movies, dancing. And it wasn't that that Henry thought that these things were good. He just said there was such a focus on these without realizing that fundamentalism speaks to all of life. Not fundamentalism. The gospel speaks to all of life. And so the question that we're seeing here is this question of social transformation. How should society be transformed? Henry and others got a lot of evangelicals, particularly younger evangelicals, to begin thinking about these kind of issues of social transformation. And so progressives began to push for social justice, to speak out against war, to be involved in racial reconciliation, and really even concerns about poverty, consumption, other global issues. And so Henry really starts off a movement to begin to think about some of these issues, and other people kind of taking up that mantle and doing it in a variety of different ways. And that's reflected, for example, the pinnacle of all this in the Chicago Declaration in 1973. So in Thanksgiving in 1973, evangelicals, progressive evangelicals, are meeting to try and address these things. Now, some of this had to do with some of the progressive evangelicals' efforts to organize politically. When Nixon ran for his second term, his Democratic opponent was a man named McGovern, and so there was an Evangelicals for McGovern group that developed. Of course, Nixon won, but these progressive evangelicals, try to take that organization and parlay that into greater evangelical engagement, and meet together, about 50 of them, to address these issues. They look at society and say, okay, there's some problems we have. There's, by this point, Nixon and Watergate, there's that problem, and the fellow evangelicals who are supporting Nixon, right? Vietnam is a big concern for them. Civil rights. The fact that fundamentalists and evangelicals are not emphasizing social and institutional evil, that they're only focused on individual evil. And so, they see these different problems in society that are just not being addressed by evangelicalism. And so they decide to write a manifesto. Now, the Chicago Declaration comes out, and there's trouble getting everybody to agree. Some people thought it's too radical. Some said it's not radical enough. Some people were concerned that there wasn't enough racial and gender diversity in the Leadership Planning Committee. Certainly there were differences about what problems should be addressed. right? Should sexism be talked about? Should pacifism be talked about? And so there were many that were part of it that refused to sign it. There were criticisms from fundamentalists. Predominantly, the criticisms were, well, some of the people that were involved in it, the issues that they did focus on, other issues they didn't focus on. Right? So, they focused on social justice, but they didn't talk about pornography. They didn't talk about drugs. They didn't talk about alcohol. Right? So a lot of focus on social sins, but not individual sins. So, it doesn't seem like it really makes a unifying movement like what it had intended to be. And ultimately, progressive evangelicalism begins to break down. They try to continue, from this and be more specific about the actions to take instead of generalities, addressing things like race and gender, nonviolence, education, politics. But, the difficulty is, everybody, some people are wanting to engage in identity politics and focus on things that are important to them from identity, gender, class. And so it led to a fracturing of this. And it also led to a lack of success politically, even though progressive evangelicalism starts being more politically active prior to conservative evangelicalism. It's not as successful. Other liberals did not like the conservative theology of progressive evangelicals. The fact that the Bible was very important to them. The fact that a lot of the progressive evangelicals weren't supportive of abortion. On the other hand, conservative evangelicals didn't like the politics. Right? So the Republican Party was much more welcoming of conservative evangelicals than the Democratic Party was of welcoming progressive evangelicals. And the religious right grew, but the religious left, hasn't really gone very far because of the political diversity and religious diversity in the Democratic Party. As we finish up, I want to just highlight a couple of things that seem to be the case with younger evangelicals today. One is that there does seem to be more of a effect of postmodernism on younger evangelicals. Not as much committed to the absolute truth that previous generations of evangelicals would be. More openness to relativism, but not an extreme openness, but more of an openness to there being truth in other places, a little bit more openness to relativism in morality, some other things like that. A lot of dissatisfaction with church in general, the way church is practiced. So that seems to be an issue. Certainly dissatisfaction with politics, dissatisfaction with the conservative politics of a lot of evangelicals. And we're even seeing some changing moral stances among younger evangelicals, more willing to cohabitate before marriage, more willingness to accept same-sex relationships, sometimes not completely supportive of homosexuality, but more open to not standing against it. Younger evangelicals still seem very opposed to abortion, for example, but in some other places there is, differences between younger evangelicals and some of these older evangelicals on issues of morality. There's certainly a lot more we could say about evangelicalism, and in a couple places as we continue we'll touch on that. But it becomes a very, very powerful force again in politics. But there's always a question, especially as the various presidential races work themselves out. This candidate wins, that candidate wins. is evangelicalism on the decline because such and such candidate won or such and such candidate lost. Evangelicalism has a way of remaking itself continually. So I do not think we've seen the last of politically successful evangelicalism. But more and more evangelicals are starting to raise questions about, what compromises have we made in the faith by choosing this particular route. And so I think that there will be some redefinition, some changes that take place, but we'll talk more about that in a later session.